Hey everybody, this is our chapter 1 in MCM 510, Media Research Methods. Today we're going to be talking about, or in this lesson we're going to be talking about science and research and just basically covering some overall concepts that you guys need to be familiar with. This is mainly coming out of chapter 1 in your textbook right here. This is the Mass Media Research and Introduction by Wimmer and Dominic. Right here, chapter 1. So the first thing that I'd like to get just out of the way as we begin is basically an understanding of what research is. Now, research in general affects basically every aspect of our lives in one way, shape, or form or another. It can be applied in a variety of ways. Many times when we think about research, we think about it in more grandiose terms than perhaps it necessarily needs to be. Generally, what we're trying to do is attempt to discover or explain something going on in our world. And what we do is try and understand it in a more formalized or even informal way. When we talk about research, we're talking about how we go about trying to understand the world around us. So, for example, what the best Tex-Mex restaurant is in town. What do you need? What time do you need to leave home in order to get to work on time? How many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Roll Pop? We hypothesize, analyze, test, and evaluate. Now, talking about these silly little examples here, if we were to talk about which Tex-Mex restaurant is best in town, one of the things we may want to do is first identify what exactly or what criteria exactly we're applying for what makes the best Tex-Mex restaurant in town. For example, are we talking about what Tex-Mex restaurant is perceived as the best in town? In which case this is perhaps survey research or focus group research. We're looking at what people think the best Tex-Mex restaurant in town is. If we're trying to find out, say, which Tex-Mex restaurant makes the most money, in this case, we are quantifying it, the best Tex-Mex restaurant as the Tex-Mex restaurant in town that makes the most money. We may even want to quantify or operationalize what a Tex-Mex restaurant is, as opposed to, say, a traditional Mexican food restaurant. Maybe they're two different things. What time do we need to leave in order to get to work on time? Well, there's several things that we would need to operationalize before we do this. For example, under what type of conditions are we talking about? What we might want to do is set up an experiment where we basically replicate the same route numerous times, maybe try different routes to see which route seems faster. Then we find the fastest route and we try it under different conditions. So, for example, busy time, slow time, maybe under different weather conditions. So that might be something. How many licks does it take to get to a Tootsie Roll center of a Tootsie Pop? May seem like a simple question, but it's actually surprisingly complex. For example, when you talk about how many licks, what exactly qualifies as a lick? Interesting question, right? Is it a single lick? Yeah. Is it putting it in your mouth and pop? How much saliva are we talking about? What flavor of Tootsie Roll Pop are we talking about? Each one could potentially require more or fewer licks. So we're operationalizing this. We're thinking about these questions in a variety of different ways, and we're approaching them in a more structured format. So the two basic research questions we deal with are generally, how do I use the tools and the two questions we're going to ask in this class is, how do I use the tools and methods of media research, and when do I use the particular research methods of statistical procedures? Let's take this in a more casual sort of way. So basically, we're talking about how do I use the tools and when do I use the tools. Easy peasy, right? This is not going to be too hard. As we go forward, we're going to basically approach all of this class's subjects from these two basic procedures. Now, when we talk about research in media, it's important to understand that research in media basically falls into one or more of four distinct phases or four distinct areas. Research is not just uniform. These phases generally talk about what are we researching, what area are we researching. For example, media one or phase one is the medium itself. So, for example, if we are examining how a particular type of medium works and what it is. So, for example, when a new technology hits the scene, we may want to research exactly what this new technology is, how it is used, how it is applied, basically the functional aspects of that technology. Phase two is how do people use that medium, the uses and users of that medium. So, if we have this new thing, or let's talk about something like social media, we may approach social media from a phase two perspective. How do people use social media? How are they applying it in their own lives? Phase three expands on this by saying, what are the social, psychological, and physical effects of that media? Not only how are they using them, but how is that medium actually affecting the individuals? And then phase four is how can or is the medium changing? So, media in general, and I want to make this clear, I'm talking about mediums and media. Medium would be, say, a physical or discrete object. Media would encompass basically all of what we would consider broadcast or traditional mass communication forms. Media, the media. Medium would be individual avenues for communication. All right? So, the media is always in flux. It's always moving forward. New practices, new technology. Well, as it changes, phase four looks at how it can, how that medium is changing, how it modifies, how it evolves over time. Okay, technology, methods, ideology, even philosophy in some cases. For example, the concept of self has changed tremendously over just the last 10 to 15 years. For example, about 15 years ago, the concept of self was all internalized. It was the idea that myself only exists within me. These days, there's a lot of debate with social media and digital media in general, whether self can be defined as basically external to ourselves. For example, our presence online, how we project ourselves into digital space, is that as legitimate of an expression of self as what we consider to be internalized? Well, if it is, that makes a lot of sense when we talk about things like cyberbullying and the effect that it can have on an individual. If that is as much a part of me as my physical being, then the effects of destroying that externalized self are just as legitimate as attacking the physical self. We can debate that, but that's something where we can talk about phase four coming into play. Your research can fall into any one of those phases or can cross between multiple phases. So you may think about that as you think about how I want to approach a research project. What phase does it fall into? All right, moving forward, mass media research in general is a bit of a mishmash. It's a bit of a combination of many, many different disciplines. We can trace our roots back to psychology, sociology, anthropology, business. There's actually a ton of different disciplines that existed before formalized mass media research came into effect that have all informed what we do. And we take pieces of those and we have expanded them specifically into media. Now, we have specific media-oriented theories, practices, even methodology in some cases, but we do hearken back to those individual fields outside of just specific media research. We can trace our roots back to World War I, and maybe even a little bit earlier, but generally back to World War I. In World War I, we really started seeing the beginning of what we would consider broadcast media. And people started getting very concerned when we expanded the ability to reach out and connect with the masses. As we jump forward into World War II, that even became more prolific. A lot of people think about Hitler and Joseph Goebbels when we think about the effect of, say, propaganda and how important it was to the Nazi war machine in pushing forward an agenda and even disinformation. But the truth of the matter is, Axis, Allies, they all had some form of a propaganda department. They all had them, they all called them something different, and they all used them almost identically. The idea was to emphasize certain messages that were advantageous while downplaying messages that were disadvantageous. So, the idea of propaganda being used for a national interest was not just specifically a Nazi technique. It was used tremendously in World War I and World War II. In the 1950s and 60s, formalized media research was really adopted into advertising in particular. If you watched Mad Men back in the day, you would have seen in the early seasons of Mad Men the characters talking about media research, in particular talking about the application of psychology in advertising and how they can play off of the motivational the motivational desires of the consumer, and how you can basically create a desire in the consumer and then offer your product as the solution to that desire. That is something that advertisers have been doing since at least the 1950s, and actually you could probably make the argument since a little bit before that. It's not always the best idea, or it's not always your most effective means of advertising to find a need or a desire and then to use your product to fill that. It's often much more effective to actually use the media to create a desire or to emphasize a desire or dissatisfaction, and then to offer your product as a solution to a problem that the audience may never have even thought that they had before. This traces itself all the way back to 1950s. Excuse me. And then obviously, as psychology was not only being used to sell products, psychologists were actually being used to investigate the impact and effects of advertising on subjects. We even got the first studies that looked at kids and how media can affect children. This jumps forward into citizen interest in the effects of media, where the public started paying attention to potential effects of media broadcasting and how important it is and how impactful it is on the public. You started seeing the rise of things like public broadcasting, even later on, warnings on certain types of content, which it's interesting when we talk about media effects. I just think that sometimes the law of unintended consequences comes in to play in quite a big way. Sometimes when you say put a warning label on something, to dissuade people or to warn them that this has content that some might find objectionable, many will look at that as something to be desirable and to buy more of. We can talk about that in other settings. Finally, media research can be used to find edges in competition between media interest. These days, research is used tremendously in the media to try and find ways of gaining edges in competition between major networks, brands, advertisers. There's hardly an area of media, of operational media these days, where you won't find research playing a key role. Now, academia, it's obviously important, but in the actual business world itself, media plays a huge role in figuring out how to strategically position your items, products, clients, your organizations, even nonprofits, how to strategically position these objects within the social space, and how to approach the public in an effective and, efficient sort of way. Okay, now we can talk more about this later on, but I did want to just drop those 4 major events on you here. Okay, so how do we know what we know? We all think we feel pretty solid about what we know, but the truth of the matter is, very few things are positivistically known. In other words, very few things do we know because we have really, really tested it, and we have experimented with it. In many cases, that's not how we know things. The methods of knowing we generally run into fall like this. Tenacity. We know something's true because it's always been true. Of course it's true. No one has ever questioned this before. Intuition. It's true because it's self-evident. It stands to reason. Authority. This is where most of our knowledge actually comes from. Authority, the belief in something because a trusted source tells us so. Even if we go back to books, in many cases, we believe the content in the book because we trust the author of the book. We believe history because we, to some degree, trust the author of whatever that history is. Self-discovery. Something is known because personal experience without an outside source. Here's where we start talking about positivistic learning, where we say, I know this because I have experienced this. And the limitations of this come down to our own experiences, though. We only know what we know, and we only know what we've had experience with. And then finally, science. This is more objective. It's organized. It follows rules. It's controlled. It's qualitative or quantitative. And it's an empirical analysis with one or more variables. Now, the big benefit of using the scientific method is that it can be replicated, and then it goes outside of our personal experience. In other words, if I create a really good study, you can create that same study and probably find something very similar to the same thing I found in your own environment, if it's externally verifiable. Okay? And if you don't find what I found, well, then that's good too, because that questions my findings, and we can have a discussion about why your findings are different than my findings. Maybe it's a problem with my experiment. Maybe it's a difference in sampling. There's any number of reasons why it could be different. Going in to talk about the actual scientific method, we ask a question, do background research, construct a hypothesis, test that hypothesis, analyze data, draw a conclusion, and then finally we report the findings. In a nutshell, that's what the scientific method is. It's a way that we can somewhat objectively investigate or inquire into a particular subject. And it's what we're going to be talking about the rest of this semester. Finally, there's 2 major schools of research, qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative research is research that uses flexible questioning. It's research that is more concerned with deep personal perspectives than necessarily just pure numerical values. The examples of qualitative research: focus groups, interviews, ethnographic research. In other words, getting into a ethnic group and experiencing what that ethnic group experiences. This is interesting. A lot of people think ethnographic research has to be limited to traditional ethnic groups, but I'll tell you, as a video game researcher, some of the most interesting ethnographic research projects I've read have actually been non-traditional ethnic groups or non-traditional ethnographies, getting into something like, say, female gamer culture. In other words, following groups of female gamers and seeing what they experience online. That could be an ethnography. And getting into, say, queer gaming. In other words, seeing what homosexuals experience in online gaming, how their perspective on, say, masculine and feminine imagery may affect their perspective on video games as a whole. These can be really interesting ethnographies as well. Okay, moving on. Quantitative research. Research method that uses standardized questions. These are things where we don't necessarily ask a question and then go into more detail and go, oh, explain that to me. Talk to me about this. We ask the same question and we get usually the same set of answers. Telephone interviews, large sample surveys, experiments, content analysis. We're counting things, and we're in most cases quantifying things into numerical values. Things that can be where we can apply some mathematical formulas to them in most cases. Here's the way that you generally can think about this when we talk about how we can generalize data. Generalized data means taking my little research project and stretching it out to society as a whole. Excuse me. All right. Quantitative data. Quantitative research. Quantitative data generally gives a great deal of generalizable information. In other words, if you conduct a quantitative research project, it's generally very easy, if you've done it well, to generalize your data to a greater population. Not hard at all. You have to meet certain criteria, but once you've done that, it's okay. It's not a problem. Now, significance of that generalized data, we can debate that. So, if you find out that X number of people have a left foot that's slightly smaller than a right foot, okay, well, you can find that probably pretty easily. But what's the significance of it? I don't know. Maybe a lot, maybe a little. But it has very limited depth of impact in some cases. Okay? Easily generalizable, limited depth of impact. It's very wide, but sometimes very shallow. Qualitative research is just the opposite. It provides really in-depth information, but usually because the sample size is so much smaller, it's very hard to really generalize data. In other words, what you mainly want to do, or what you often want to do with qualitative research, is maybe find a quantitative project and then use a qualitative research project to maybe dig deeper into that quantitative project or that quantitative result. That makes any if that makes any sense. Hope it does. All right. Some things that I want you guys to think about as you go forward. When you select a topic, this is one of the more difficult things that students run into, especially here at the beginning when you really need to start thinking about what you want to do for this project in this class. How are we going to figure this out? So, let's run down some questions that you can ask, okay? First off, is the topic too broad? That is one of the problems that a lot of students run into. They've got this great question in their mind. Man, it's going to be great. I'm going to change the world with this. Well, that's great. But typically, if you're wanting to change the world, it could take your entire career to figure out the really big questions. What we want to do is figure out something where you can find really, really good, solid results that can maybe make a little bit of a step forward in the right direction. So try and tap the brakes and say, all right, if my big question is this, what's the first step toward answering that? And is there some step I can take in a legitimate sort of way? Next, this may seem a little bit strange, but can the problem really be investigated? Maybe I'm asking the wrong question. Maybe my own biases are getting in the way. Maybe I'm asking something that, frankly, you can't really look into. Maybe there just simply aren't any answers to this because maybe it is just something that's kind of lost in the human psyche or in the human heart. And even if I were to get data, maybe it would be all fairly inconclusive. So we really have to ask ourselves, is this a problem that can be investigated? Can the data be analyzed? Will any data be generated be significant and meaningful? Kind of like the left foot question. Can it be generalized over a larger population? And if so, so what? This brings us to the next question. Is the problem significant? Is it something that anybody will care about, frankly? If you're going to spend the time and the effort and maybe even the money if somebody is paying you to do this, is it a problem that merits the time and attention? Or is it something that maybe only a very insignificant group of people actually care about? You may also ask, can the results of the study be generalized? Can they be stretched out to the rest of the population? Maybe there's a way that I can maybe rephrase the question or the concept to make it more generalizable. Another way of thinking about generalizing your information is to consider what we call external validity. If you can generalize your data, you can establish external validity. Those are generally considered the same thing. External validity is the ability to generalize your data to a larger sample or a larger population. Next, what costs and time are involved in the analysis? Is it going to take you literally years to gather data? For example, survey research is very, very interesting, but survey research takes a long, long time to gather enough data for it to be meaningful. So maybe a survey isn't as important or as applicable as maybe doing 2 or 3 focus groups. Is the planned approach appropriate for the project? Well, if you don't take the time to plan your research properly, you could be doing a lot of effort and get no meaningful results. It's entirely possible to spend a lot of time doing a lot of things and get no results that actually will be useful. So take the time to slow down and make sure that all the pieces are in place before moving forward. Is there any potential harm to a subject? If you're using humans, you have to pass your research through what's called the Institutional Review Board, the IRB. It's usually not that big of a deal, but it's part of any research project. To basically outline your project, send up a review to the IRB. They will look at it and say, yeah, seems good. Or, we've got some questions about this. And then they'll sign off on it eventually, and you'll be good to go. But it basically is an external group that makes sure you're not going to harm anybody with your research project. Okay, we talked about this a little bit. External validity is the ability to generalize data to a wider audience. Internal validity is, simply put, the ability to say, yes, my research project actually investigates what I say it's supposed to investigate. You'd be surprised how often that actually is a problem, where I say, well, I really want to investigate this subject, but what I actually constructed is an experiment to investigate something completely different. We have to make sure that we are on point the whole time. One of the easiest ways of doing that is to think about Occam's razor. Is this the easiest way to approach the problem? That's it. Don't over-engineer things. Figure out the easiest, simplest, most direct way to engineer your project. Go with that. All right, we're going to go through these pretty quick. These are some things that can can sometimes cause some problems when you're setting up a research project. We call these confounding variables, sometimes referred to as artifacts, but confounding variables are things that can get in the way of a research project or get in the way of getting really solid data. First off, history. Events outside the study that possibly affect the outcome. So for example, hey, your subject had a really bad breakfast before they came in and did a focus group. Now they're angry. Okay. Well, the bad breakfast had nothing to do with your focus group, but it had something to do with your focus group results. Maturation. The biological or physiological changes over the subject in the experiment over time. Maybe we start with a person who is a kid and they grow into teenhood. Well, just that biological change could have an effect on how people answer questions. The actual testing itself could change how people react. The instruments that you use could affect how the research project goes. Sometimes the testing tools can become unusable over a certain amount of time. For example, you could use a piece of technology that just becomes obsolete. Statistical regression. Subjects that are extremely high or low on pre-tests are likely to move toward the average in post-tests. We'll talk about that a little bit later on when we talk statistics. Experimental mortality. I've run into this a couple of times myself. If you have a particularly long project or a particularly difficult project, sometimes people just drop out. Sample selection. Sample groups should be random and tested for homogeny to ensure the composition doesn't cause differences in results. In other words, you want your sample to basically be the group that you want them to be. So you want to make sure that you know who you're sampling before you do your research project. Demand characteristics. Subjects' reactions to experimental situations. There's often a disconnect between what the subject reports and what is actually true. Many tell researchers what they think they want to hear. This happens a lot. Whenever subjects think they know what is being tested, they will often tell the researcher what they think the researcher wants to know. The other thing that's kind of interesting is if the researcher is looking at something that may be embarrassing or maybe a little bit taboo, subjects will sometimes tell the researcher what they think is socially acceptable, as opposed to reporting legitimate results. So sometimes instead of doing surveys in groups where everybody can see each other, maybe doing like one-on-one interviews instead of focus groups would be a better approach for something that might be a taboo subject. Experimenter bias. This can come into play a lot. A researcher must endeavor to be objective and let his or her findings speak for themselves. This is one that I've spoken with many of my students about recently, considering how divisive, especially things like race and gender topics are today. You can't go into a research project as an activist. Even if you have activism in your heart and mind, you really have to go in as a researcher and then let the data speak for itself. You'll find that the data itself is much better advocate than trying to force data to make your arguments. Let the data speak for itself. You'll find that it's a much, much better spokesperson that way. Evaluation apprehension. This goes back to what we were talking about before. Subjects can sometimes be afraid of being evaluated and thus give distorted results. Again, taboo subjects. Casual time order. Problems can arise based on the order of the experiment. It's actually causal time order, particularly when a subject experiments with multiple parts. So, when you do an experiment that has, say, multiple tests, post-test, pre-tests, maybe they test numerous times so you see how they react to something over time, what can sometimes happen is they get normalized to the result or normalized to the experiment, and then things happen because they're being tested, not because of whatever the conditions are that you're actually trying to test. Diffusion or imitation of treatments, the ability of participants to communicate with each other, may lead to replicated results. If you're having your subjects in the same room, if they're in a waiting room together, and maybe they see each other regularly, it's entirely possible for them to talk to each other and influence each other's results. If we do tests with students, say, in a classroom, it's entirely possible that they look at each other's results and go, yeah, this guy next to me is saying this, so I'm going to say this too. Compensation. All groups, control and experiment, in experiment should be treated identically. You can't necessarily compensate one group without compensating the other. They have to be treated equally, and they should not feel as if one group is the more important group and one group is sort of the afterthought. Compensatory rivalry. If participants know they are in a control group, they may purposely attempt to skew the results. This can also happen in the experimental group. This goes back to the one we said before. If they know that they're the ones that are really the ones that you're taking a look at, some people just want to watch the world burn. Some people just want to throw a monkey wrench in the situation. The best thing you can do is keep your subjects guessing as to what you're actually looking for until after they're done, and then you can tell them exactly what you were testing. Most of the time, that works pretty well. Finally, demoralization. If a group, control, or experiment simply loses interest in the experiment, then the results may not be valid. If you're doing a survey, for example, and then all of a sudden you start seeing in the results someone go from normalized grouping of answers to 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, that's probably an indication they just got bored and stopped taking it seriously. Well, that wraps this up for me on Chapter 1. I know this was kind of long. I'm going to do these for every chapter if I could, and hopefully it's going to help you guys as we go through this book. If you have any questions, as always, get in contact with me, and I will try and clarify any questions you might have. I'm Dr. Casey Hart, and I'll see you next time.